I forced my friends to watch Island with them. And then I first birthday watch. I love bolo tie, so thank you. I very bit spicy than I thought. I stayed hot too long. Only got to like that. And over here, that's like literally. Better body. Trying to get his face done. It's gonna be a Tuesday. Yeah. Yeah, I think no infection and a tetanus shot later. I cut it on the can. I mean, you can't open it up. And the worst, not the worst part, like the injury is probably worse, but like I walked in the kitchen. It was like a pen can. She was like trying to get it open. She's like pushing it down. I was like, hey, stop. Like, you know how you start those off? And then I couldn't get it, so I was trying to really get on it. And I slipped and I sliced it open. But if it got me, it's like, you better not do that. And then say, oh, watch, I'm fine. I'm cool.
There should be.
So I went, like, we kind of just took care of it, like, well, yesterday. Sorry. But like, wanted to the health center today, and they're like, well, it's been 24 hours, like, kind of like, we don't do stitches. After that, like, and they looked at it, like, actually, you guys seem to do it, I've done a pretty good job. Like, use some of the, like, liquid bandage stuff and just kind of kept gauze. But then they just, like, looked at it over, they gave me some of those, like, little, like, kind of like suture bandages. I had to keep it closed. Oh, shoot, it's at the big one. Turn yellow, come back. You know, but it, a course, so.
No, and Robert didn't even know which one was what.
He was texting me, I was like, there's 3 of them.
I was like, God.
I didn't They were like, when was the last time you had your tetanus shot? Well, our records show.
I'll figure it out.
These glasses, he was like, well, that wasn't 10 years ago.
Like my previous number last year was like right before I went to trauma. So they're like, yeah, everything's up to date.
Yeah, that's the thing, like, I've given my recommendation records to so many like different hospitals.
Yeah, usually
like 2 or 3.
You were in the same job. Oh, no. Yeah. Oh, that's so weird. Oh, my God. Yeah.
But it's like just like one off because it's not like I've never like primarily went to the hospital. But so. I think so.
Yeah, but in the like doctor sure it also has like
Yeah.
That's like when I my first book I was like, I walked in, they were like, you go to a flu shot? You just like boosters with this. So I was like, yeah, you shoot me up, dude. Like, whatever you got, I'll take it. Okay, how long do I have insurance? Yeah, get all the.
I know.
He's like, oh, I don't want to say it. She's like,
That way to get short because I'm like Christine and stuff, but I'm feeling.
What insurance?
My Ross, recorder.
Oh my God, I love that.
Are you good at it? Oh, but I can, happy birthday.
Can you do it tomorrow? Like again?
I could, I can do it tomorrow.
All right, folks, we'll get started. I just wanted to introduce Dr. Watrous. Dr. Watrous and I worked together at graduate school at the University of Memphis, where she was involved in a lab studying addictive behaviors. She completed her internship at UCSD San Diego VA Health Center before taking a role as research scientist and grant writer at Scripps Health. She then spent time as a researcher at the Naval Health Research Center and Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. She currently serves as the Director of Clinical and Scientific Affairs at Modern Health, a health tech startup company, helping companies provide employees with access to digital mental health care services. Her talk today is going to walk us through a bit of this journey and some of the issues, considerations that informed her decision to pursue a career in health tech. So please help me welcome Dr. Watrous.
Well, it is so nice to be here today. Can everybody hear me okay, first and foremost? Okay, awesome. Before we jump in, I do want to just say I love a talk that is interactive. So if you have questions as we're going, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'll pause for questions, but really would love you guys to throw out questions that you have and anything that you're just curious about learning more. And if we're covering it later, I'll let you know, but otherwise feel free to interrupt. So we will not be getting started. I lied to you. Or Josh lied to me. There we go.
There we go.
All right, so first and foremost, I work in tech. I communicate almost completely in memes and GIFs at this point. So please prepare for that. That was actually a huge switch for me, moving from a research role into a tech role, is just like how tech people talk and, you know, how you communicate and how, you know, emojis are like a totally commonplace professional thing in your Slack with like even your CEO and your COO. So anyway, just for your forewarning. This is a little bit of an agenda about what we'll go through today. So we'll talk a little bit about my path specifically. How did I actually end up here? And then we'll talk about what health tech is, and really specifically mental health tech. And then spend some time talking about kind of the good and the bad and the ugly. So really kind of transparent discussion about what I love about what I do, what challenges about what I do, and then the pieces that honestly are really, really difficult for me. And then also we'll talk a little bit more broadly about psychologists in tech. We'll focus specifically on health tech, but thinking about this in terms of what sort of opportunities are there for psychologists, what sorts of things are psychologists doing, all of those pieces. Any questions before we get started? All right, so let's do a how it started, how is it going? I think the first piece that I need to make very clear is that I did not plan this. I would love to say that this was like a really cohesive career plan that I laid out when I was in grad school. That would be factually incorrect. And also really not possible because at the time that I was in grad school, which was, gosh, a lot longer than I really am fully prepared to disclose at this point, health tech was really just starting. It was really unclear what was going to come from it, right? So we did, obviously, there were apps. Obviously, people were creating apps related to mental health, but especially when I was in school, we were really hesitant to get involved with them. It was really unclear how we were going to figure out how to blend rigorous and ethical care with tech. We just didn't know. So it wasn't even a path that I would say was being considered when I was in graduate school. So this is kind of the curvy path that I went along. I started as an undergrad at Cal State Stanislaus in California. I had a bachelor's in psychology with a minor in Spanish. At that point, I knew that I wanted to go and get a PhD in clinical psych. And I landed at the University of Memphis, where I was focused on health psych. And a lot of my research during that period of time was focused on addiction. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these stages later. I, again, was walking a pretty traditional academic background or path. So I did postdoc and internship at San Diego VA and UCSD, a lot of NIH grant funding, both through grad school and through postdoc. And then for the first time, took a veer off the path, went and worked at Scripps healthcare system. And so this is a non-academic healthcare system that did have NIH grant funding. So it was kind of on alternative, but really functioned very similarly to working in a traditional academic healthcare system. And then took another jump. And that's when I ended up at the Naval Health Research Center. I also do still have a small private practice where I do direct clinical care. And after all of that, I took my hugest leap about a year and a half ago and ended up as a director at Modern Health. So let's jump in, let's talk about the grad school years. Obviously, I mean, I think undergrad is not as interesting of a part of my story as like really grad school is where it started. So I was on, again, a pretty traditional academic path. So I was publishing, these are some of the journals we were publishing in, these are some of the studies that I was publishing. So a lot of my work was coordinating NIH-funded trials of, or RCTs for brief motivational interventions for alcohol use. And so that's the work that I was doing. I was doing a ton of behavioral economics work as well. It was in a lab that was really, you know, we were focused on grant funding and publication, really a very traditional academic lab. And that's what I spent the majority of my time doing. And to be fully fair, obviously Josh made me in grad school, it was always a little bit tense for me to decide if academia was the right path for me. There are things that are a part of being an academic that I do that don't come as easily for me as my counterparts, right? So grant writing, writing manuscripts, obviously I published, obviously I wrote grants, but it didn't come as easily for me. But at that time, I wasn't really questioning whether or not this was the path that I was gonna go, because it didn't feel like there were that many paths available to me. So really it was, what was being positioned at that point for us was really like, people went into academia, or they went to the VA, or they went and did private practice. And I wasn't quite sure where I was going at that point. I did start exploring the VA, and that became a really important part of what I did during my internship and postdoc years. And so I matched at San Diego VA UCSD consortium. Again, since I was a health-focused person doing addictions work, I got probably the best fit match I could have, and I was doing treatment in the alcohol and drug treatment program and the behavioral medicine clinic at the VA. I also, at that point, felt very strongly, and still do, about VA care and military care. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is as well. So I really enjoyed my time at the VA. I continued to publish during that period of time. My first exposure to VA grants, which the mechanisms work slightly differently than NIH, but at the end of the day, you know, it's still grant funding. And so I was doing some of that. I was working as a clinician for some VA grants, group VA grant funded studies. So there was a study where we were looking at treatment for co-occurring substance use disorder and PTSD. So I was both a clinician for that and then also publishing off of that data. So again, pretty traditional in terms of how we're thinking about what people are doing when they're preparing for academia. I also had two of my biggest like L's during this period of time. So the first thing that happened was I submitted a K-23 towards the end of my postdoc. And so K-23 is a mentored clinical research award, more or less, and it did not get funded. Now, it was funny, I was talking with my husband about this last night. I remember how devastating that was. I remember being absolutely gutted by that. Here we are, like 10 years later. I cannot tell you the name of that grant. Like I literally cannot think of the name of that grant. So that was kind of the first thing that made me be like, okay, what are we doing here? What's the plan if the next step, which, you know, the next step was always to secure grant funding. If I don't have that, what am I doing? The other thing that happened was that during this period of time, I applied for a faculty position at San Diego State University. We'll talk again a little bit more about why San Diego was so central to what it was that I was doing, but I didn't get that job because I didn't bring grant funding with me. It was a very clear, that was like exactly what I was told. Again, I was devastated at the time. Now I look back and I'm like, oh, that quite literally is the best thing that ever happened to me. So those were two big things that happened to me during that period of time that made me really need to evaluate what I was doing and where I was going. And the biggest challenge there is that all of the institutions that I was applying to, UCSD, where I would have had grant funding to stay on board and get a faculty position, or San Diego State, required that I be on soft money. And so is everybody familiar with kind of this idea about soft money? Okay, so the idea behind soft money, and anybody that's faculty can correct me, there's not like a better way for me to describe it, but it really is that like you need to have money to keep your job. So you bring in your grants, and that is what secures your position. At UCSD, the tracks that they have are pretty, I mean, for lack of any better word, they're cutthroat, right? So when we were talked about what tenure looked like at UCSD, it was either you make the cut for tenure or you get fired. Like, it's not like there's any sort of like additional layers to it. There were two options. Do what you need to get tenure, and that includes grant funding, or you will not be at UCSD anymore. So soft money and really thinking about how I was going to string together a number of grants, both my own, being involved in others to pay my salary, was not a good fit for me. There are plenty of people that do this and do this very well. They're very successful at it. I think the biggest thing that I have to call out is that the things that don't come as easily for me tend to come easily to those people, right? So in a situation where my entire life would depend on grant funding, and I had never written a grant and still have never written an NIH grant that didn't end in me crying, it didn't feel like the best way to move forward. So this is really kind of the first time that I was like, okay, if I'm not walking this track, if I'm gonna jump off academia for real, what would that look like? And so that took me to my first real job. And so I transitioned over to the Scripps healthcare system, which is a large healthcare system in San Diego that is not directly affiliated with any academic partner. However, that was in the process of changing. So I worked with a psychologist who was a close colleague of mine, who really, it was her mission to bring the same level of rigor to the work that she was doing at Scripps and what you were seeing in the academic healthcare system. So she had, in the years that I was there, I think she got 2 or 3 R01s. So those are the largest NIH grants, which is like an impressive feat in a matter of like 3 years. And so she was not joking about what she was planning to do. So I went to work with her as a research scientist. I also was splitting my time to do clinical care, and we stood up a behavioral health integration program. So this was a co-located program with the endocrinologist in an outpatient setting so that we could do truly integrated care. Loved those things. The challenge for me here is that the infrastructure didn't exist to make this seamless. So I spent a lot of my time convincing people why the things we were trying to do were important, setting up processes for even being able to do the things that we wanted to do. And it just was not quite the way that I wanted to be a psychologist. And so I took my next jump, which was into the most non-traditional research setting that I had been in to date. So Scripps, even though we weren't technically academic, we were doing all the same academic type things. We were working on NIH grants, we were going to conferences, we were publishing, we were running trials. It looked pretty similar. This is probably the first time that things were a little different for me. So this is when I moved over to the Naval Health Research Center. I have to call out the reason that says Valor is because this is my proudest acronym to date. I'm really bad at acronyms, but I named my department the Veterans and Active Duty Longitudinal Outcomes Research Team. So I just need everybody to know. It's a multidisciplinary research team that I led for about 5 years while I was at Naval Health Research Center. The picture over on the right-hand side, that's the peninsula at which the base that I worked on, so the Naval Base Point Loma exists. So that little green spot, like basically where I was, I had this like amazing view of the San Diego Bay in buildings that were like basically crumbling. Like they were literally World War II barracks. So they probably should not have still been standing, but the view was amazing. So this was the first time that I was doing something that was probably the most different than what I had been doing. So I had no more NIH grants to be worried about. I didn't write one the entire time I was there, nor was I expected to. I was doing DoD, so Department of Defense or military funded research. That funding works very differently. Sometimes there are kind of traditional grant mechanisms, but there are a lot of ways to get funds for research in the DoD. And so you have to get a little bit creative to figure out how to pull in money. But in a lot of ways, it was not a soft money environment because I didn't have to worry about whether or not I closed a grant and then could keep my job or keep my salary. So we were publishing in some different journals than I had been publishing previously. Our largest study was the WWRP, so the Wounded Warrior Recovery Project. We were tracking longitudinal physical and mental health outcomes for injured service members. That was the biggest thing that we did. And then the other piece of this is that I also was not active duty military, nor was I a government employee. I was a contractor working for a large company called Leidos. So I worked for Leidos and then technically supported Naval Health Research Center audit. The rest of the story. So I know we don't usually talk about personal things in something like this, like a professional talk, but you cannot understand my story if you do not understand the personal context in which that story is happening. So up in that upper right-hand side, that is my little brother. My little brother deployed for Afghanistan when I was in graduate school. It was a fundamentally life-altering event to be going through graduate school at the same time that he was in Afghanistan. In fact, I think I was at Josh and Tara's one Thanksgiving when he called me on a sat phone, and that was how we had conversations about his deployment. So that really shifted my focus. That's when I really started a veterans and active duty focus. The complicated piece of this is that my brother came home from combat, as many veterans, but not most veterans do, with traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, and he went on to develop an opioid use disorder. My brother died in 2019 of an opiate overdose, and it fundamentally shifted the way that I understand and think about addiction care. So you can't understand why I would be willing to take risks, why I would want to do something differently without understanding that the impact that had on me. The other piece of this, the easier piece of this, that I accidentally fell in love when I was in San Diego. And then I ended up with 2 step kiddos who I love very dearly, but who have pretty complicated medical needs and who need to be in San Diego. So at the end of the day, the conversation gets much smaller when I have to stay in a place for the good of my family. And so I think it's really important to call that out, because a lot of times when we talk about making academic journeys, when we talk about all of these things, the idea would be that we could jump and move wherever, and that just wasn't an option for me. Questions about any? And so then I took the biggest jump about 1.5 years ago, and I ended up at Modern Health. We're going to talk specifically about like what even is modern health, but like what is health tech? But that was the biggest jump that I took. And again, it was the culmination of all of these things. I need to be in San Diego. I feel deeply different about how I think about mental health care than I did at the beginning of my training. And I think that tech has something to offer in terms of how we're going to solve some of those problems that I was facing. So let's talk about health tech. So some quick facts just to kind of ground everybody in terms of like what it is that we're talking about. Health tech is a large, it's an umbrella term to refer to a number of different kind of organizations that are intending to address some sort of gap in existing healthcare. And so there's not a set definition, right? Sometimes people include device companies in there, sometimes people will include data companies in there. But then there's a set of companies that are like potentially providing direct care or thinking about how better to provide direct care. So I just like thought of a few off the top of my head. They're covering a number of different healthcare concerns. So Amada Health really focuses on cardiometabolic concerns, for example. The Maven Clinic is really focused on women's health. So there are hundreds of companies thinking about healthcare using tech in some way to address some sort of gap. There's a lot of different business models, and this is also really important. So it's your business primer of the day. D2C is something that we use to describe when a business model is focused on selling directly to a consumer. So the idea would be, think about like, has everybody heard of like Talkspace or BetterHelp? Anybody in this room could go to that website and start using that platform. You could pay Talkspace or BetterHelp directly and buy their services. So that's one model, and that's one way to build a health tech company. Then there's also B2B. And so this is when businesses like Modern sell to other businesses. So no one in this room could go onto the Modern Health website and just like download the Modern Health app. You could download it if your employer had purchased it as a benefit for you. There's some nuances in here, it gets a little bit more complex sometimes, but these are kind of 2 of the frameworks to keep in mind. There's also some of these startups, some of these companies are venture-backed startups, and we'll talk a little bit about what venture capital is as well. Questions about this? So, what even is a startup? Has anybody watched Silicon Valley? All right, we got a couple. So typically, and I'm sure that you all have heard this when you hear about tech startups, right? This idea of disruption. So think about Uber as a really good example of a tech startup that was really focused on kind of some of the clear things that startups normally focus on. Disrupting an industry. So rather than going in and doing things similarly or iterating on how that industry currently functions, right? Uber didn't go in and think about like, let's give taxi cab drivers access to an app, or let's think about how we can improve the taxi experience. They went in and fundamentally disrupted the industry and created a very new way for us all to access rides. So disruption is usually a really key focus of startups. The other piece of this is taking a minimally viable product and focusing on growth. So a minimal viable product is the smallest skeleton of what you plan to build and building with that. So how, for those of you, how does that sit with you in terms of how you do your work currently? Does anybody feel like you take a minimally viable product and like send it to your mentor? I think not. Right? So there is a huge juxtaposition between how tech thinks and how psychologists think. Right? How many of you feel like you need to get a draft of a manuscript into perfect shape before submitting it? Right? That is not how tech people think, right? What is the base level available for us to launch something? So, you know, the example that one of our directors gave us that I think is like really useful to think about. If the question is, how do I take something, how do I get from point A to point B using a wheeled vehicle? We may think, well, the best way to do that is build a car with safety features, think about how that car can be comfortable. Tech people will tell you the best thing to do is get a scooter and then start building off of that scooter. It is a fundamentally different way of thinking than how most psychologists ever think. The other piece of this is growth. So you may have heard startups often throw around this idea of grow or die. The idea being that most companies are working towards going public, right? That's usually the goal for startups, and the way to get there is to grow. There's a variety of different ways that people do funding. Sometimes people bootstrap for a long period of time, but what's up here is pretty traditional. So the idea is that bootstrapping is, you know, putting your own money or even like maybe close relatives' money in to kind of get you up off the ground. Seed funding is when you have like angel investors, so maybe a couple of wealthy individuals that are going to give you some more money to help you get started. And that takes you into Series A, B, C, D funding rounds. And that's when you're getting venture capital money. So venture capitalists are large companies. So you think about companies like Sequoia. There's a group of really wealthy people who are pooling their money, and they are giving tens and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars to startup companies to get them up off the ground. When you really dig into venture capital, it's more or less gambling, because those companies are giving tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to other companies with no guarantee. If you bet on an Uber and you give Uber $70 million in Series A, I don't know that that was their Series A, and then Uber goes public, I think with a $5 billion valuation, you own a portion of the company and you get that percentage, right? That is a massive win. If you give some other random company $70 million and that company tanks, that money is gone. It is not a loan. Nobody paid you back for it. That money is gone. So this is a pretty typical path for startups. And it's very important to understand this so that you can understand the context in which startups are also thinking about how they meet the needs of their backers, right? So boards are a very common part of decision-making, and thinking about how those decisions are made and how you separate out business decision from healthcare decision is a really important part of this conversation. Questions about any of this? To give you a little bit of an idea about mental health tech and mental health startups specifically, this graph I think is really useful to understand. You can see over the far right-hand side, Modern is actually considered like a generation 1 mental health tech company. I think it's really funny to see this because Modern has only been around since like 2018. So the company itself is only like 5 years old, and it's already like kind of like old news. So you can see here on this far side, companies that you may have heard of, like Calm, Headspace. Those companies are also in this package. They're labeled unicorns because that's a term that you give to a startup once it hits a $1 billion valuation. So people like to have lots of milestones to kind of track progress of a startup, and that is one of those milestones. But you can see that these have branched, right? So the generation one, we were really focused on selling to employers. How do we sell a benefit to employers for their employees? Generation two is really thinking about like, how do we create a better network? And then make it easier for people to access care independent of their employers. And then this last one, this generation three, has really started to take a focus on specialties. So we have PTSD care, we have specific addiction care, pediatric care, those sorts of things. So we're starting to see these companies come to light that are going to be really, really heavily focused in those domains. So what does modern even do? I think that's probably a really useful thing to talk about before we like keep going, so you know like what kind of company are you actually working at. So like I mentioned, we are employer focused. We sell this benefits to employers so their employees can go on and use it. And what we're thinking about when we design our care, when we think about how to deliver care, is this full spectrum of mental health needs. So this is very different, again, from how I was trained as a clinician, right? So as a clinical psychologist, a lot of the work that I was thinking about was really focused on that dichotomy of disordered versus non-disordered. And we're thinking about a broader range. So for those individuals with more severe mental health needs, right, or with severe depressive disorder, maybe PTSD, the idea would be that we would connect them with a therapist who's doing evidence-based care. Then, when we think about the broader population of any given workplace, we know that the majority of them are not actually going to be in that level, but we still want to offer them something that they can use to address, improve, or maintain their mental health. So we have coaches as a part of what we do. Our coaches use evidence-based techniques, right? So those that are doing kind of any mental health coaching get trained up on cognitive behavioral techniques. And then we also have content. So this is where we have things like meditations. We also have psychoeducation on a variety of topics. You could take a course about sleep that's going to be grounded in CBTI principles. You could take a course about parenting that's going to be grounded in kind of best practice for child and adolescent care. And then we're thinking about that across all of these pillars. So rather than people only coming in when they're looking for mental health care, we want people to consider, you know, their overall well-being. Are there things they'd like to do in terms of improving their relationships? Are there parenting skills they'd like to learn, right? So we have content for that, we have coaches for that, we have therapists, should that need rise to the level we're spent for free. And then across the bottom, you can see all the variety of care options, right? So people can go to therapy, people can get psychiatry and management, they can do coaching. We have a group offering that happens live and also on demand. And that is so many different topics. I think that was like one of the biggest shifts for me was when you build mental health at scale, right? So we have 1 million people that are eligible for modern health. So just the sheer number of things that we need is a little bit, can be overwhelming to me. It's not something that I was used to. So we have a ton of different groups and then a ton of different digital content. And over on the far right is kind of legacy employee assistance program stuff, because that is frequently where we are studying and trying to sell. Questions about any of this? So let's be real about what it is that I like, what it is that I don't like, all that good stuff. I think the first thing that I need to share is that the team that I have the opportunity to work with is just the absolute best. So this is our clinical strategy and research team at Water. I do need to call out that like a huge chunk of us came from really traditional academic backgrounds and really reputable academic background and ended up here. We also have a number of people that have health tech experience. So somebody that's come from Omada, somebody that's come from BetterUp, and then also people with payer experience. So payer is like insurance payer. So the Blue Cross Blue Shield background. But this is the team that at a corporate level is thinking about how modern health should be thinking about mental health. So none of us deliver direct patient care. Some of us do direct clinical research, but for the most part, what we are doing is trying to influence the company and make sure that the decisions that other teams, for example, product, we're talking about what product is, are consistent with best practice, right? Because at the end of the day, you could leave a tech company to develop a mental health app, and they will, right? We know they exist. There are plenty of mental health apps and plenty of mental health platforms that exist with zero to no clinical oversight or decision making. And so our job is to prevent that from happening and really make sure that people understand maybe the ethical ramifications of decisions they're making. That we think through what does the evidence tell us, right? What does data tell us about a given condition or a given type of work so that we can make sure that people are really getting kind of evidence-based care. So that's the best thing. This is me. So I am the Director of Clinical and Scientific Affairs. It's important to know that when I started in Modern Health, that position did not exist. So there was this idea of what I could do, and then we needed to figure out like, well, what am I actually going to do? So the first several weeks of my job were literally creating the scope of my job. It was a bizarre thing. But you can kind of break it down into an overarching objective, right? So the goal is that my job is to make sure that both the clinical and the scientific work, the foundation of the work that we're doing, is being correctly communicated, both internally and externally, right? So that the company understands it, but that also, the people that are considering buying Modern Health, or the people that have bought Modern Health, understand that work. And the way that I do that is often the most likely is to serve as a liaison between my team, which is the FNR, and other teams within the company, like sales, partnerships, client success, which really is just, the best way to kind of describe that would be like customer satisfaction. So client success is when somebody has purchased Modern Health, they get a person that's going to support them in launching the platform and driving engagement for their employees and tracking their outcomes. So it's really important. It's not necessarily a direct clinical role, but it has really important ramifications for the population health of any given organization. And then also marketing. We work really closely with marketing. Again, to make sure that the clinical and scientific advances that we are doing are shared correctly, but also in a compelling way. And then the other piece of this is that I often serve the clinical voice of the market. So I am the person most likely to be in external facing sales calls, client calls, conferences, when we're talking about the clinical things of Modern Health, when we're talking about how we think about care, when we're talking about our research. I'm the person that's most likely to be doing that. Now, the piece that I would call out here is I'm doing all of that work almost entirely with non-mental health experts. So I have this really clear memory of my postdoc advisor at one time, which at the time I was like, I don't know what to do with it, telling me that if I couldn't explain my work to an eighth grader, then I didn't understand it as well as I thought I did. And now I look back on that and I'm like, that is critically important to what I do every day. It would be really easy for me to walk into a room and jump into the nitty gritty of any given intervention or diagnosis or any of those pieces. But the vast majority of the people that I work with don't have a psychology background, right? So I would be jumping 1,000 steps ahead of what it is they know and what it is they need to know is the other piece of that. And so a huge part of what I do is thinking about what is my audience, who is my audience, and what do they need to understand about this topic that I'm about to discuss. Questions about it? You can't see this, it's kind of small, but a week at a glance. This is my calendar. It's a lot of time. For better or for worse. I couldn't decide if this was like a good, a bad, or an ugly. It just is a truth. The vast majority of my time is spent in meetings. So some of these are sales meetings, right? So some of these are pitches to clients or to prospects. Some of these are discussions with our clients. Some of these are team meetings, both for our entire company, but then I also sit in on my team's meeting. I sit on the marketing meeting, I sit in a sales meeting, right? So I'm in a lot of meetings, and then other pieces of these are one-to-one. And so that's actually really enjoyable. Time where I get to connect with my colleagues about like what they're up to, how my work is impacting their work, what their work is doing that I need to know about, that sort of stuff. And so things that I love, things that I love less. So what I would say is that some of the things that I absolutely love about what I do are the opportunity to solve complex problems in innovative ways. Sometimes my brain feels like it's melting. Lots of times it feels just really reinforcing and really invigorating to think about, okay, how would we do this, right? So recently we were talking about how we can better improve our substance use care, right? Again, that's the world that I came from many, many years ago. But when I was doing substance use care, we were talking about much smaller populations, right? We were talking about either individuals presenting for substance use care, which we know is not the vast majority of people with substance use problem, or even people that we were screening in specific ways. But thinking about that, when we cover 1 million lives, what would it look like? And what would it look like if I could get tech to build me something really, right? What are the things that we can pull out of the data that exists that we can use some sort of tech innovation to make it scalable, right? We don't need a person to do every single thing of this, right? We don't need a person to do assessment, right? We can do a fair amount of screening using some sort of new product, right? So it's really cool to think about that. It's also really cool to do that with partners that think entirely differently than I do. So I really enjoy that. I do not miss government bureaucracy even for 1 second. A huge chunk of why I left the Naval Health Research Center at the end of the day is because it was impossible to move quickly. And that became really difficult for me when you had this good work about what we were doing, about how we could improve life, about how we could impact quality of life. And it was so challenging. Everything moved at a snail's pace. So not having to deal with that is a huge relief for me. I love working remotely. I'm one of those people that will likely not ever go back into an office. That's just me. I like that most of my days are different. I can do everything from be on a sales call to talking about, substance use treatment to doing a press interview all within the same day, right? So my activities are wide and varied. It is very difficult to get bored on any given day. Like I said, I feel mentally stimulated by the work that I do. I love the team that I get to work with. It's just really cool to have the opportunity to work with them. And I like learning from partners that are doing very different things than I am and that have a lot of background in things that I have no idea about. And then to be completely honest, like the compensation and equity, right? So my pay is pretty solid. I also have equity in Modern Health. We'll talk a little bit more about what that even means. But those things are nice additions. I also get a lot of the nice little like tech fringes, right? So I have unlimited PTO. I have some additional benefits that are kind of a nice fit. And again, like a very informal and like laid back work setting that is kind of a relief for me. Things that I love a little bit less. Building an airplane while you're flying it is both terrifying and incredibly challenging. It's what we do, right? So you are trying to sell a product in a very competitive environment. So you need people to understand what you do, even if like what you're going to be doing in 6 months when they launch and what you do now are different. How do you get them to understand that and be accurate and ethical and truthful in that work, right? So there's a lot of pieces there that can be really challenging. I will say, even though I don't miss bureaucracy, I do sometimes wish that there was more time to make decisions, right? Tech moves quickly, and people are not joking when they tell you it moves super, super quickly. There are times where we are making decisions on kind of large scale implementation. We're going to do that within maybe a matter of weeks, right? We're going to get all the people in the right room and we're going to figure it out and we are going to move forward, right? There is no time for a 4-year trial to figure out how to do something. And that can be, it can be nerve-wracking for me as a function of like, that's just not how I was trained to work. And then even though it's in the twice or remotely, I do miss being in person with people. I'm not willing to give up my remote work, but there is something slightly inefficient about how we have to work completely on Zoom. I can't hop into somebody's office and be like, hey, I remembered you said X, Y, and Z, like, let's talk about this really quickly. I can't get an entire team together to brainstorm in a really more natural way. So there are definitely challenges to that. And then ambiguity, right? So like I said, every day is a little bit different, that's great. But like what is in my lane and what is in somebody else's lane is not always set out. The company is literally just, we're 4 or 5 years old. We're figuring out who does what. And so we're making it up kind of as we go. So that sometimes is really invigorating for me. I know it can be really challenging for some of my peers. Let's talk about money. So One of the most common concerns that I hear when I talk to people about the fact that I work in health tech is concerns around the idea that I work in a for-profit industry. And I think that those concerns are definitely valid, or something to be considered, but I want to challenge us to think about this from a different foundation. All healthcare in the United States is a business. It may not be a for-profit business, but it is a business. Money is relevant both at a systemic level or a system level for any given organization, and for you as an individual working within that organization. None of those conversations were things that I ever had in graduate school, really in internship, and not really in postdoc. The most conversation I remember having about money in postdoc was, what is the least amount of money you're willing to take until you get your grant? What's the smallest salary you're willing to live on until you get your grant and can have like your real salary? So my personal opinion is that we need to be involved in this conversation. We need to be involved in them at a policy level, right? There is a reason that reimbursement rates for mental health care professionals are abysmally low. We cannot sit out of those conversations, right? We cannot pretend that money is not a part of how we think about mental health care. That we need to be part of those conversations. You need to be thinking about money if you are going to stay in academia, right? Writing a strong budget and a budget rationale are important skills when it comes to grant writing, right? If you're going to open a private practice, like, how are you going to pay your bills from this private practice, right? And a lot of us have really interesting thoughts about what it means to be a psychologist and like doing this work for the love of the game and because it's the right thing to do. And really, like, you still need to figure out how you're going to pay your bills. And so thinking about those conversations, I think, is a really important foundation. And so when you take that foundation, you think about the fact that like, this is a business anywhere. Modern health is also a business. It is a for-profit business. Profitability is a thing about how we're thinking about delivering care. I am not convinced that those two things are mutually exclusive. Delivering quality care and making a profit are mutually exclusive. I will also fully own that in my ideal world, this would not be an option. Right? We would not have capitalist practices when it came to healthcare, but it's not my ideal world. So how are we going to deal with that? Some of that includes kind of thinking through, what is it like to be in a place where profitability is an indicator of success? Is that something that feels comfortable for you? Is that something that is just absolutely intolerable for you? Understanding that you will experience traditional business practices that you won't have come into contact with in academia. So tech, unfortunately, is in a recession. You may have seen at the beginning of this year, massive layoffs at companies like Meta, at Google. Modern Health has gone through 2 rounds of layoffs. That is the first time in my entire career where I have ever had peers or other colleagues who left involuntarily. It was really hard. It was really difficult. And it's difficult on the majority of that is because like people that I cared about no longer had jobs, and that's really challenging. It's also very confusing to figure out, do I agree with this decision? How do I feel about this decision? What's my role and my purpose now that this decision has been made? And how do I either disagree and commit or make a different decision? And then the other piece of this is cross-functional partners. So we use the word cross-functional partners instead of multidisciplinary, but there are going to be people that know more than you. So you can be an excellent psychologist and know nothing about business, right? I know nothing about, there's all sorts of like rev ops. So that's revenue operations, right? I could probably learn it for sure, but I need to understand and present with some humility so that it's not that like I show up and I'm the one with a PhD, so everybody should listen to me when there are huge chunks of running a business that I fundamentally don't get. Questions about any of this? Concerns? So you think you're interested in tech. I pulled a few. This is like a random smattering of job ads that are out there. Over on this left-hand side, you can see this is an example. Like, health tech is not the only place for psychologists, right? Companies like Amazon, Zillow, Apple are often hiring people with our sorts of expertise. Sometimes that can be data and research, right? That is a often sought after expertise in tech. Sometimes that can be like an understanding of best practices when it comes to like thinking about health and healthcare. So there are opportunities. We'll focus ours more on health tech because that's where I spend the majority of my time. That's what I know the best. But you did see, again, a smattering of some job ads that showed up when I was looking for this. So, you know, a clinical innovation manager. I don't know really what that means, but you know, we would be good fits for it. You know, you have content writers. So companies are cranking out content on an almost constant basis, right? They need to have content that is true, that's accurate, that's evidence-based, right? There's a really good place for people to fit in those sorts of roles. And then healthcare economists, data journalists, again. So data research, healthcare economists, like those are things you will see coming up a lot in these health tech companies. So what are the roles? So there are kind of like a few traditional paths, and it's kind of funny to say traditional again, because like these companies are new. This is really young, we're just figuring this out. But these are a few of like kind of the most common paths that you may see for psychologists. So for those of you that are clinicians, direct clinical care is an option, and it's something that I think we'll see more and more for psychologists, for MFTs, for counselors, because these companies are building massive networks, or they're hiring internal employees to do direct clinical care. So there is an opportunity there to do direct clinical care if that's something that you want to do. Now, the flip side of that is, you may have heard, there are lots of drastic differences in terms of how clinicians are treated at a variety of different places, right? So if you follow any of the news, you know, BetterHelp and Talkspace often get dragged for just how little they're paying their clinicians. There was a lot of drama about, I guess it's been a year and a half ago, the company Cerebral got dragged in front of Congress because there were accusations that like basically they were just like churning out stimulant medication prescriptions, right? And there were a lot of clinicians saying they were very uncomfortable with how business was being done. So definitely things to keep in mind, because then on the other side of that, you have companies like to say Modern, right? Lyra, Alma, those sorts of companies that are prioritizing high reimbursement rates for clinicians to recruit them into their network, right? So for comparison, I think I know like all the numbers a little bit. So for comparison, traditionally through some healthcare plans, you know, a psychologist maybe could get reimbursed for $75 for an hour, which in San Diego, where people are charging $200 as private pay, like that's not enough to get a lot of people to come and join that network. Alma has figured out a way to set up a separate network, recruit people into that network, where reimbursement rates can get between 150 and 175. So now you have a hook, right? You can pull clinicians in because it's going to give them an easy way to fill up their caseload, and they're getting much closer to their self-pay number. So this idea that like people will be thinking about this, right? Whether it be you or people you know, whether or not these companies are good fits for them, and understanding which are kind of operating by best standards and which ones are not is a really important part of that conversation too. The other pieces of these would be clinical strategy, or kind of like this idea of corporate clinical. That's the team that I work on. So again, this may be an internal team within an organization that's not providing direct clinical care, but that is thinking about how clinical care should be delivered. So my team is informing on everything from what sorts of providers do we recruit to the network, right? So we don't do the recruiting. We have a massive operations team that does that, but operations team doesn't know whether or not, I mean, now they do, but like when they started, what is cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Like what's conversion therapy? Can I recruit somebody in the network that says they do conversion therapy? That's where clinical strategy and research comes in, right? These are the types of providers we're looking for. This is what we expect from our providers. This is what needs to happen to make sure those providers come in and are meeting our needs. And then thinking about quality on the back end, right? We ask our members to rate their experience with any given provider. And as we all know, there's going to be times where people are just not a good fit, and that's totally fine. There's going to be other times where it's a quality issue, right? We wouldn't expect operations to be able to know those differences. So clinical strategy, clinical quality, and corporate clinical teams are often kind of responsible for that. And in a good setup, they are influencing decision of a health tech organization. Then you have research and data analysis. So we at Watrous stand for us, Lyra, and a variety of other ones have internal clinical research teams. So our clinical research team functions largely in a way that you might in academia. The big difference is that they do not have to apply for grant funding because the company is funding their research, right? So our director, our senior director of clinical research, Cynthia Castro Sweet, you know, she has a huge background. She came from Omada, she's at Stanford, Omada, and now she's at Modern Health. And what she's doing is collecting data that demonstrates that the product works, that Modern Health works, presenting it at conferences, writing papers, really stereotypical clinical research type things, but in a very different setting. There's also a lot of data analytics that's separate in some places from that sort of clinical research, right? Companies need to understand their data, whether or not they're publishing it in peer-reviewed papers. They need to understand whether or not people are getting better. They want to know who's engaging with what, right? So data analytics becomes a really important part of that conversation. And then you have user research. So you may have seen this as like UX, UR, UI. And this, I've heard a lot about a lot of PhDs being a really good fit in those roles. So the idea is that user research is often thinking about what it is that users want, what's going to drive the best possible experience. What are they looking for? What turns them away, right? So your foundational research principles are going to set you up really well to be in those sorts of roles, right? The way you think about asking questions, the way you think about gathering data is a really nice fit for user research. And so that's why I think one of the ways that people end up going with PhDs is in there. The other piece of this, and these are starting to grow, but this idea of kind of clinician business leaders or psychologist business leaders or whatever. Those are roles like mine where I'm not doing direct clinical research. I'm not really driving a ton of clinical strategy. I'm taking the work that those teams are doing and I'm thinking about how to make that business relevant, right? How do I express that in a way that is compelling, that makes people want to buy Modern Health, that makes people want to stay with Modern Health? How do I go out into the market and make people understand that the team, the clinical strategy and research team at Modern Health is credible, right? We don't want to keep them hidden because then people think like, oh, well, like who's making your decisions, right? How do I go out and take that information out into the market? So those sorts of roles are starting to grow. You also are seeing more founders, not just psychologists, right? We're seeing MD founders, we're seeing PhD founders. So people that have decided like, you know what, like I'm just gonna go out and start my company, right? I'm gonna go start and address this gap that I've seen and I'm gonna get started on that. And then also product specific roles. So product is the term in tech that people use to describe kind of just the app or the experience overall. So, you know, the product team at Modern Health is maybe working with their engineers and tech to design whatever new thing we want to launch in the next few weeks. So there is a move now for some psychologists to start thinking about being product managers. Product management is like something that like still seems overwhelming to me. It is high level like management of really technical things. You need to be very detail oriented. There are very specific skills that product managers have, and like kind of some specific training that they tend to have. And you can get this, like it's not that you can't as a psychologist, but that you would be navigating like, okay, if we want to launch a new substance use assessment, I am now the person that's responsible for figuring out how to get that from point A to point B. I need to think about who's going to design this. I need to think about what it's going to look like. I need to get clinical's approval. I need to talk to legal to make sure I'm like dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. That's kind of a product manager. So you're seeing some psychologists move into those roles and then also into even higher level roles. That's the other piece that I should mention in all of these. These are kind of lines. They don't necessarily describe the ability for kind of trajectory, which all of them have, right? So a lot of these companies have chief clinical officers, chief medical officers, there's chief research officers, there's chief product officers, and there are psychologists that are filling those roles in a variety of different companies. Questions about any of this? So some questions to ask yourself. If this is something that you're thinking about, and hopefully like this is not just like some like fancy pitch, like hopefully you're walking away with like a relatively balanced view of what it is that I do. I really like being in tech. I don't see myself leaving tech. Tech is not for everyone. And that's totally fine. The question that you would want to consider, first and foremost, what is your risk tolerance? And this is going to help you answer one, first and foremost, is tech for you? What would it be like for you if you had to go through a reduction in force, if people were laid off, right? And the answer to that shifts, right? Like my answer coming out of postdoc would not have been what my answer is now, right? Like I have the privilege now to be able to tolerate that sort of risk. I may not have been able to answer that same question immediately out of postdoc. The other thing that it can guide you on in terms of like, if you want to go health tech is like, where, right? So going into a company that's at seed funding is inherently more risky than going into, say, a Series D company, right? Series D companies are like almost public. Not to say that they don't have their own issues, but they're much larger. They tend to have processes in place, right? There's movement towards being not being a startup. And that will really tell you, you know, like, do you want to be a seed company, right? Like, are you willing to tolerate the risk that that company may fail, that there's a higher likelihood that that company may fail than you would at a later one? Those are really important pieces to consider. How do you want to be compensated? So, as you may have heard, right, when Facebook went public, made a lot of millionaires because people had equity in the company. Basically, they had they had an ownership stake in that company. So when it goes public, there's money to be made. That only works if your company succeeds. So startups regularly compensate partially in equity. It is really common for that to happen, but that doesn't mean anything if your company fails, right? So again, this goes back to that risk tolerance conversation, right? The pay is still good, comp is still good, but like it's not the same in more as it would be in more established tech where maybe you're not going to get the same amount of equity. Do you want really clear job expectation? You want to know what you're going to be doing every single day, and you want it to be kind of predictable. Tech is going to be challenging. And again, not that there's one way that's right or wrong, but it's just important to know which pieces feel right for you. Do you like to work only with psychologists? I go back and forth on this one. I love working with my team, right? I absolutely love talking with other psychologists. I feel like we have a shared language, right? We have a shared amount of experience. We're thinking about problems in similar ways. It's very, very reinforcing for me to work with psychologists. I also really like working with non-psychologists. But again, all those things about working with psychologists that are great. Working with non-psychologists, like, you don't have shared language, right? There's a very high probability that the person that you are owning a task together took intro to psych one time, and you are not sharing the language about mental health, right? So that's a really important consideration about whether or not that's something that might be frustrating for you or something that you would find enjoyable. What do you prioritize in your work? You know, do you want structure? Do you want very clear paths? Do you want security and stability, right? Do you want to know kind of exactly what's going to happen? Those are really important questions when you're considering an option to like move into tech where things can be a little bit unpredictable. And then what's your tolerance for ambiguity and change? There's one constant in tech, and again, I am a newbie, but I've heard this time and time again from people that have been at Lyft, from people that have been at Uber, from people that have been at Google. Like the one constant is change. You may think you're going to be working on something at the beginning of the year, and 6 months later you'll be working on something very different. So being able to tolerate that is going to be really important for success. I have a few recommendations here. I think these recommendations are really useful to all of us as we're considering our career options, right? Building relationships, networking. LinkedIn comes in really important in industry. So, you know, if it's something that you're considering, it doesn't hurt to get one started now. Thinking about how you can get experiences and maybe if there's coursework that would be relevant to you. Maybe that's not psych coursework, right? Are there any marketing classes or the business classes or the certificates that you could get that maybe put you in a place that you think would be really useful? I can potentially share out, maybe we can figure out a way for me to share some of these resources. This is a table of organizations that are really specific to like tech. So there's one called Therapists in Tech. There's one called Well, which is really kind of focused on women leaders in health tech. So these are all great to start kind of checking into. And then the last is that we'll share some resources. I had a colleague that wrote this really great article specifically for behavioral medicine scientists, but it's really applicable to everybody, about what sorts of things you could be doing. If this is a path that you want to take. And then checking out those groups, there's also a couple of websites that have mailing lists that I think are really useful. I would just be cautious, right? Just this week, Science put out an article about something called the cheeky scientist, which is really it pitches itself as a way for PhDs to end up in industry positions. And Science wrote a pretty scathing review of their practices, and potentially that sounded kind of predatory. So just be careful if this is something that you're thinking about. There's lots of ways to do this without spending thousands upon thousands of dollars. But yeah, so that's it. And with that. Yeah. This one? More back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm laughing. Yeah, we'll see you later.
Thank you.
She's great.
It's good. You got everything you needed?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
Maybe.